Welcome back. Tonight, we're tracing the complete story of William Afton, the man whose ambitions twisted family entertainment into cycles of tragedy that still echo through metal and memory decades later. From business partner to serial killer, from living man to undead monster, from physical horror to digital nightmare. This is the journey of Five Nights at Freddy's most persistent villain, the businessman. Origins and partnership with Henry Emily. In the haze of the late 1970s, when arcade cabinets glowed in darkened rooms and pizza parlors promised simple joy to families seeking affordable entertainment, two men joined forces with a dream that would reshape their industry. William Afton and Henry Emily, each bringing distinct skills to their partnership, founded what would eventually become Fazbear Entertainment, and though the seeds of their collaboration sprouted something smaller first. William Afton arrived at this partnership as a businessman, someone who understood finance and operations, who could see market opportunities where others saw only whimsy. His background before meeting Henry remains shrouded in mystery, with no confirmed details about his early life, his education, or what led him to the entertainment industry. What we know is that when he encountered Henry Emily's mechanical genius, he recognized potential, saw dollar signs in dancing robots, understood that children's laughter could translate into sustainable profit if properly packaged and marketed to anxious parents seeking safe, affordable outings. Henry Emily provided the creative counterweight to William's business acumen. An inventor at heart, our Henry possessed an almost childlike enthusiasm for bringing inanimate objects to life through clever engineering and programming. Where William calculated profit margins, Henry sketched endoskeletons. Where William negotiated contracts, Henry refined servo motors. This division of labor seemed natural at first, each man operating in his domain, their skills complementing rather than competing. Together, they established Fredbear's Family Diner sometime in the late 1970s, a modest restaurant featuring two animatronic performers. Fredbear, a golden bear with a friendly demeanor and a top hat, served as the establishment's mascot and namesake. Beside him stood Spring Bonnie, a golden rabbit whose cheerful appearance masked the dangerous innovation hidden within both characters' mechanical bodies, and the Springlock suits represented Henry's crowning achievement and William's greatest business asset. These weren't simple animatronics that performed on schedule then powered down. These were hybrid creations, capable of functioning autonomously through their robotic components, but also able to be worn by human performers when entertainment demands required a more personal touch. The mechanism was elegant in concept, using a series of spring-loaded locks to compress the animatronic components, the endoskeleton, the wiring, the mechanical parts, into compact positions against the suit's interior walls, creating just enough space for a human being to climb inside and operate the costume manually. From a business perspective, this versatility was brilliant. One suit could serve double duty, reducing overhead costs while maximizing flexibility. Need a roaming character to greet children at their tables? Send in an employee wearing the Spring Bonnie suit. Want an automated stage show while staff focus on serving food? Let the suits run on their programmed routines. William understood this efficiency, appreciated how it streamlined operations and reduced the need for separate costume inventory. But the spring-lock mechanism carried inherent dangers that would prove catastrophic. The locks themselves were delicate, requiring careful winding and maintenance. Moisture, even something as minor as sweat or humidity, could cause the compressed springs to loosen, When that happened, the mechanical parts they held in place would snap back to their default positions with tremendous force, the endoskeleton reasserting its shape in fractions of a second. Anyone wearing the suit when this occurred would find themselves crushed by their own costume, metal rods and wires piercing through flesh, as the machine reclaimed its space. Employee training materials from this era, preserved in audio cassettes that would surface years later, detailed the precautions necessary for safe spring-lock suit operation. Workers were instructed to wind the mechanisms tightly before entering the suits to avoid any sudden movements that might jar the springs loose, to never, under any circumstances, breathe too heavily or allow perspiration to build up inside the costume. The warnings were delivered in calm, almost casual tones that belied the horrific nature of the accidents they aimed to prevent. Despite these risks, or perhaps because William never fully grasped their severity, Fredbear's family diner found success. The novelty of seeing golden animatronics perform, of watching children's faces light up as Fredbear and Spring Bonnie sang and danced, created exactly the kind of family-friendly atmosphere that parents sought. Word spread through the community. Birthday parties were booked. The cash register rang steadily. During these early years, the partnership between William and Henry appeared functional, if not particularly warm. They shared business meals, discussed expansion plans, debated which animatronic characters might join the lineup as the company grew. Henry focused on refinement, constantly tinkering with the spring-lock mechanisms, trying to make them safer, more reliable, more sophisticated. William focused on scaling, on transforming this single successful diner into something larger, a chain perhaps, a brand that could expand beyond their small town into neighboring communities and eventually across the state. But beneath William's professional demeanor, something darker simmered. Resentment built gradually, fed by small perceived slights and comparisons that gnawed at his ego. Henry had a family that seemed happy, a daughter named Charlotte, who would visit the diner and squeal with delight at the animatronics her father created. Henry worked reasonable hours, prioritized family dinners, spoke with genuine warmth about his wife and child. William noticed this, noted the contrast with his own family situation, felt the sting of comparison, even if Henry never intended one. Where Henry created for the joy of creation, William increasingly saw utility, the purpose, application. The animatronics weren't art to him, they were tools. The restaurant wasn't a dream made real, it was revenue. Children weren't the heart of the business, they were the market demographic. This fundamental difference in perspective would widen over time, a crack in the foundation that neither man recognized until far too late. The success of Fredbear's family diner led naturally to expansion discussions. They couldn't stay small forever, not with demand growing and competitors surely noticing their innovative approach to family entertainment. Plans emerged for Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, a larger concept that would feature a full band of animatronic performers, not just the two spring-lock suits. William pushed for rapid expansion, seeing opportunity in every successful weekend at the diner. Henry urged caution and wanted to perfect the technology before scaling up, worried about maintaining quality control as they grew. This tension, business ambition versus artistic integrity, became a recurring theme in their partnership. William would propose aggressive timelines. Henry would advocate for slower, more methodical development. Usually they found compromise, but the pattern revealed a growing disconnect between their motivations, their values, their very understanding of what they were building together. William also began establishing his own ventures separate from the partnership. Afton Robotics emerged as his personal company, a separate entity from Fazbear Entertainment, where he could pursue his own mechanical interests without Henry's input or oversight. This wasn't necessarily adversarial at first. Many business partners maintain separate interests. But it established a precedent, carved out a space where William operated alone, where his decisions went unchallenged, where he could explore ideas that might not align with Henry's more cautious, family-focused philosophy. Looking back through the lens of everything that followed, it's tempting to search these early years for warning signs, for moments when someone could have intervened and changed the trajectory of what was coming. But that's not how slow descents work. There were no dramatic breaking points, no single conversation where William revealed himself as the monster he would become. There was only accumulation, small resentments compounding, private thoughts growing darker, a man who felt overshadowed gradually concluding that he deserved more recognition, more control, more power than his partnership allowed. The late 70s rolled into the early 80s. Fredbear's Family Diner continued operating. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza moved from concept to construction to opening. The animatronics performed their programmed routines night after night. Children celebrated birthdays beneath colourful balloons. Parents relaxed over pizza, grateful for an evening's entertainment that didn't strain the budget. And William Afton, businessman and co-founder, smiled and shook hands and counted receipts, while something cold and calculating took root behind his eyes. The father, the dysfunctional Afton family, while William Afton built his business empire alongside Henry Emily, his personal life unfolded in parallel, though the details remain frustratingly incomplete in the historical record. What we know with certainty is that William married, though his wife's identity, her background, even her name, have been lost to time or deliberately obscured. What we know with tragic clarity is that this union produced 3 children, each of whom would suffer for having William Afton as their father. The eldest child, Michael Afton, appears in the narrative as a teenager during the early 1980s. Physical descriptions from later encounters paint him as having light brown, almost auburn hair, parted in the middle, and blue eyes that would later carry the weight of guilt and determination. As a young person, Michael seems to have inherited some aspects of his father's more troubling personality traits, specifically a tendency toward cruelty masked as humor, an ability to justify harmful actions by framing them as jokes or pranks. Elizabeth Afton, the only daughter, possessed a curiosity that William would eventually exploit for his own dark purposes. She's described as having been drawn to the animatronics her father created, fascinated by their movements, their voices, their mechanical magic. This innocent interest, this childlike wonder at her father's creations, would prove fatal in ways that William either couldn't foresee or simply didn't care enough to prevent. The youngest son, known throughout the community and later among fans as the crying child, due to his frequently tearful state, carried the heaviest burden of fear in the Afton household. His given name remains uncertain, with Evan being a common assumption among those who've studied the family history, and though it's never been definitively confirmed. What's undeniable is his terror, his constant state of anxiety, his justified dread of the very animatronics that represented his father's professional success. The Afton home, wherever it was located, functioned more as a collection of isolated individuals than as a cohesive family unit. William threw himself into his business ventures, spending long hours at the diner, or planning future expansions, or working on animatronic designs in his private workshop. When present physically, he remained emotionally distant, treating his children more as inconveniences or occasionally useful test subjects than as people who needed guidance, affection, protection. Mrs. Afton's role remains one of the great mysteries in this story. Was she present? Did she try to intervene in the dysfunction that pervaded their household? Did she leave early on, abandon a situation she couldn't fix or didn't want to endure? Or did something more sinister explain her absence from the narrative? The silence surrounding her suggests either deliberate concealment or a tragedy so complete that no record survived. Without effective parental supervision, without adults setting boundaries or modeling healthy relationships, the Afton children developed their own cruel dynamics. Michael, likely absorbing and reflecting the emotional coldness he experienced from William, tormented his younger brother relentlessly. The crying child became Michael's primary target, a convenient outlet for whatever anger or confusion Michael himself was processing. The bullying took many forms, but it centered around the one thing the crying child feared most: the animatronics. Michael understood this fear intimately, knew exactly which buttons to push, which threats would provoke the strongest reactions. He owned a foxy mask, styled after the pirate animatronic from Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, and would hide in closets or behind doors, waiting for his brother to pass before leaping out, mask in place, unleashing a predatory scream that sent the younger boy into panicked tears. These attacks weren't isolated incidents. They formed a pattern, a sustained campaign of psychological torture that Michael and his friends would escalate over time. The crying child couldn't find safety anywhere. Home became a minefield of potential scares. School offered no respite, as Michael's friends would join in the torment. Even trips to Fredbear's family diner, which should have been treats or celebrations, transformed into nightmares as Michael and his gang would corner the younger boy, surrounding him with Freddy, Bonnie, and Chica masks, recreating his animatronic fears in human form. William's response to this systematic abuse was silence. He witnessed the bullying, certainly heard the crying child's screams and sobs, but never intervened. No discipline for Michael, no protection for his youngest son, no acknowledgement that the situation demanded parental action. This negligence, this active choice to allow harm to continue, reveals as much about William's character as his later crimes. He simply didn't care enough about his children's well-being to inconvenience himself with parenting. Instead, how William pursued a different approach to managing his youngest son's fear, one that aligned more with his interests in surveillance and control than with actual emotional support. He installed cameras and speakers inside a Fredbear plush that the crying child carried everywhere, a comfort object that provided the opposite of comfort. Through this toy, William could monitor his son's movements, listen to conversations, track his location throughout the house. Sometimes he would speak through the plush, using its voice to deliver cryptic warnings or hollow reassurances. Phrases like, "Tomorrow is another day," or "You are broken," that offered no real comfort while maintaining William's invisible presence. This surveillance setup demonstrates the mindset William brought to fatherhood. Rather than talking to his son directly and holding him when nightmares struck, addressing the bullying or the boy's legitimate fears about the animatronics, William chose technological mediation, treating the situation as a problem requiring monitoring rather than a child requiring love. The Fredbear plush became an extension of William's control, a way to observe his son's deteriorating mental state without taking responsibility for improving it. The crying child's fear of the animatronics wasn't irrational, despite how William and Michael treated it. He had witnessed things that justified his terror, caught glimpses of his father helping employees into the spring-lock suits in back rooms at the diner, seen the tight confines, understood at some level that these machines weren't purely friendly. His young mind couldn't articulate the specific danger. He couldn't explain why Fredbear and Spring Bonnie filled him with dread, but his instincts screamed warnings that everyone around him dismissed as childish anxiety. Night after night, the crying child would confide in his Fredbear plush, whispering his fears into its soft fabric, unaware that his father listened from some remote location, taking notes perhaps, observing his son's psychological state with the detachment of a scientist studying a specimen, rather than the concern of a parent watching his child suffer. These one-sided conversations, preserved in memory and later recreated in symbolic form, paint a devastating picture of isolation. A young boy so desperate for reassurance that he sought it from an inanimate object because no human in his life proved reliable. Meanwhile, Elizabeth occupied a different but equally troubling position in William's attention. Unlike the crying child, whom William seemed to view with indifference, Elizabeth drew her father's focus in ways that would prove fatal. She wanted to please him, sought his approval, showed interest in his work. This should have been positive, a daughter connecting with her father through shared curiosity. But William's work involved death and suffering, though Elizabeth didn't know this yet. Her fascination with the animatronics, particularly with Circus Baby, an animatronic William specifically designed with her aesthetic in mind, would become the mechanism of her demise. The Afton household then consisted of an absent father obsessed with his business and darker pursuits, an absent or entirely missing mother, an eldest son who processed his own pain through cruelty toward the vulnerable, a daughter seeking connection with a father incapable of healthy love, and a terrified youngest child slowly breaking under the weight of unrelenting fear and isolation. This was the family structure in which William Afton's children grew up, shaped by neglect and dysfunction into people who would carry trauma forward in different ways. Michael would eventually seek redemption for his actions, though that wouldn't prevent the irreversible harm already done. Elizabeth would become something else entirely, her innocence corrupted by possession and programming. The crying child would die young, his brief life defined by fear his father could have addressed, but chose to ignore. And William himself would continue his descent, and each family tragedy either failing to register emotionally or actively fueling his twisted experiments. When people later tried to understand how William Afton became capable of such monstrous acts, they sometimes pointed to his family situation, searching for trauma or abuse that might explain his behavior. But the evidence suggests the opposite causal relationship. William's nature, whatever darkness lived in his heart, created the family dysfunction, not the reverse. He was the source, the problem, the poison that contaminated everyone around him. The Afton family existed as a warning, a demonstration of how a parent's emotional absence and active malevolence can destroy children who deserved better. They weren't villains, not initially. They were victims of the man who should have protected them, casualties of William Afton's inability or unwillingness to be anything resembling a decent father. The first murder, Charlotte Emily, in 1983. The year 1983 marked a turning point. the moment when William Afton crossed from dysfunctional father and resentful business partner into something far worse, a deliberate taker of innocent life. His first known victim was Charlotte Emily, the daughter of his business partner Henry, killed outside Freddy Fazbear's Pizza in an act that combined cruelty with calculated opportunity. The circumstances surrounding Charlotte's death reveal both premeditation and impulse. A party was underway inside the restaurant, children celebrating beneath balloons and streamers, their laughter mixing with the mechanical voices of the animatronic performers. Charlotte, known as Charlie to those who loved her, somehow ended up locked outside, separated from the safety of the building and her father's watchful protection. Whether this was accidental, a door closed by an unknowing employee, or deliberate, arranged by William himself, remains unclear. What's certain is that Charlotte stood alone in the alley beside the restaurant, rain beginning to fall from darkening skies. Her green bracelet, a tracking device linked to the security puppet that Henry had programmed specifically to protect his daughter, registering her location outside the building's safe perimeter. The puppet, designed with remarkable care by a father who understood risk, even if he couldn't prevent every contingency, responded to the breach, attempted to reach Charlotte to bring her back inside where she belonged. But William arrived first. Driving through the rain, spotting the small figure alone and vulnerable, he made his choice. The motivations behind this decision have been debated extensively. Some point to jealousy, William's resentment of Henry's apparently happy family life, a family that highlighted by contrast the dysfunction in William's own home. Taking Henry's daughter could be understood as revenge for an imagined slight, punishment for Henry's success in areas where William felt inadequate. The fact that this was Charlotte, specifically, the child of the man whose creative genius overshadowed William's business contributions, suggests personal animus rather than random victim selection. Others argue that Charlotte's murder was opportunistic rather than vengeful, and that William saw a child alone and took advantage without complex emotional reasoning. This interpretation aligns with later evidence of William's systematic child murders, suggesting he killed because he could, because something in him found satisfaction in the act, because his moral constraints, if they ever existed, had eroded to the point where murder became permissible. Regardless of motivation, the act itself was swift and brutal. William killed Charlotte Emily in that alley, leaving her small body in the rain as he departed, returning to whatever alibi he'd arranged, or simply driving away confident that no one would connect him to the crime. He was a respected businessman, co-founder of the establishment, someone who belonged in the area. Any witnesses seeing his car would think nothing of it. Perfect cover. The security puppet, meanwhile, struggled against the rain. Its mechanical components, designed for indoor operation, encountered problems as water seeped into joints and circuitry. Sparks flew, motors faltered, but Henry's programming proved strong enough that the puppet pressed forward anyway, crawling through puddles, approaching Charlotte's lifeless form with a determination that transcended its artificial nature. It collapsed beside her, circuits failing completely in the downpour, metal arms extending in what appeared to be an embrace, a machine attempting comfort even as its systems shut down. In that moment of connection, something extraordinary and terrible occurred. Charlotte's spirit, her consciousness, her essential self, transferred into the security puppet, binding to the machine that had tried too late to save her. This was possession, and the first confirmed instance of a human soul merging with an animatronic, though it wouldn't be the last. The mechanism behind it remains mysterious, debated among those who study such phenomena. Some attribute it to the specific trauma of the death, the violence creating conditions where the soul couldn't or wouldn't move on. Others point to the puppet's protective programming, suggesting that Henry's intention to keep Charlotte safe created a kind of spiritual anchor that her consciousness clung to. Still, others reference agony and remnant, concepts that would become central to understanding possession, arguing that Charlotte's death imbued the puppet with something that made the binding possible. What's undeniable is the result. The security puppet gained awareness, sentience beyond its programming, a protective instinct that would extend far beyond the single child it was designed to guard. Charlotte Emily, now the puppet, would become a guardian of other murdered children, a force working against William's future crimes even as she remained trapped in mechanical form. For William, Charlotte's murder represented a threshold crossed. He had taken a life. He had looked into a child's eyes and chosen violence. And rather than experiencing remorse or fear of consequences, he discovered something else, a fascination with what happened next. Charlotte's death didn't lead to his immediate arrest. Police investigated surely, asked questions around the neighborhood, spoke with employees. But William's position as co-founder provided perfect cover. He had reason to be near the building. His presence couldn't be questioned, and the investigation eventually cooled, filed away with other unsolved cases. Another tragedy in a world full of tragedies. This lack of consequences emboldened William, demonstrated that he could act with impunity if he remained careful. But something else captured his attention even more powerfully than the ease of evasion. He became aware of the security puppet's change, noticed behavioral anomalies that suggested something beyond mere programming malfunction. The machine moved with purpose. Its eyes tracked people in ways that suggested recognition, judgment. It seemed protective of specific children, drawn to them in a manner that exceeded its original parameters. William, always more scientist than human being, began forming hypotheses. What if Charlotte's death hadn't ended her completely? What if something of her persisted in the machine? What if trauma and death created conditions for spirit to bind with mechanism? These weren't questions driven by guilt or horror at what he'd done. They were purely intellectual, motivated by a curiosity about an unexpected phenomenon. This discovery, or suspicion, would reshape William's trajectory. Killing Charlotte had been personal, revenge or impulse. But if death could lead to possession, if souls could be harvested and bound to animatronics, then murder became something else entirely, a means to an end, a necessary step in experiments that might unlock secrets far more valuable than simple revenge. Understanding possession, controlling it, replicating it, these became William's new obsessions. Henry, meanwhile, mourned his daughter. The details of his reaction remain private, are glimpsed only through later actions and statements. He knew someone had killed Charlotte. Whether he suspected William specifically, or simply mourned without direction for his anger, is unclear. What's evident is that the partnership between Henry and William, already strained by philosophical differences, fractured further under the weight of this tragedy. How do you work alongside someone when your daughter's murderer remains at large? How do you focus on business when grief consumes you? The security puppet remained at the restaurant, continuing its protective routines, watching over children who weren't Charlotte, but who still deserved safety. Henry may have understood what had happened, recognized that his daughter's spirit lingered in the machine he'd created to protect her. Or perhaps he only suspected, hoped. I clung to the idea that Charlotte hadn't entirely left. Either way, the puppet stayed, a sentinel powered by programming and something deeper, something that transcended circuits and servos. For the community, Charlotte Emily's death was a tragedy, a reminder of the random violence that could strike anywhere, even outside establishments designed for children's joy. For Henry Emily, it was the loss of his daughter, a wound that would never fully heal. For Charlotte herself, it was transformation, death leading not to peaceful rest, but to permanent vigilance in mechanical form. And for William Afton, it was revelation, the discovery of possibilities that would drive him to murder again and again. Each death a data point in experiments that valued knowledge over humanity, understanding over empathy, power over morality. 1983, the year of Charlotte's murder, the year possession became real, the year William Afton discovered that death wasn't an ending, but potentially a tool. Everything that followed, all the horror still to come, traces back to this moment in the rain. A small girl alone, a murderer seizing opportunity, a mechanical guardian arriving too late, and the terrible binding that transformed tragedy into something supernatural. Family tragedy. The bite of 83. Later in that same catastrophic year of 1983, the Afton family experienced their own devastating loss, though this one resulted from neglect and bullying rather than deliberate murder. The crying child's death during his birthday party at Fredbear's family diner became known as the bite of 83, an incident that would haunt Michael Afton for the rest of his life and further demonstrate William's failure as a father. The days leading up to the birthday party formed a crescendo of terror for the crying child. Michael, emboldened by his friends and unchecked by parental authority, escalated his torment. The Foxy mask remained a constant threat, but Michael added new dimensions to the abuse. He would lock his younger brother in rooms at the family home, trapping him with the lights off while making animatronic sounds from outside the door. He would chase the boy through the house, always wearing that cursed mask, always knowing exactly how to maximize fear. At Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, during visits that should have been fun family outings, Michael and his gang of equally cruel friends would corner the crying child near the animatronics, knowing his terror would spike when surrounded by the very characters that populated his nightmares. They would laugh at his tears, mock his attempts to hide beneath tables or behind their parents. The pattern was clear: deliberate psychological torture, sustained over weeks or months, wearing down an already fragile child. William observed all of this through his Fredbear plush surveillance system and did nothing. He tracked his youngest son's deteriorating mental state, listened to whispered confessions about the bullying, heard the desperate pleas for protection, and chose not to intervene. Whether this was simple negligence, too busy with work to care, or something more calculated, an experiment in fear that paralleled his later documented fear experiments on other children, remains a disturbing open question. The crying child's birthday arrived. In any healthy family, this would have been a day of celebration, a chance to make a frightened child feel special and loved. Instead, it became the setting for tragedy. The party was held at Fredbear's family diner, the very location the crying child most feared, surrounded by the golden animatronics that dominated his anxiety. Whether William chose this venue out of obliviousness or deliberately forcing his son to confront his fears in the most traumatic way possible. The decision proved catastrophic. Michael and his friends saw opportunity. The birthday party, with its festive atmosphere and distracted adults, provided perfect cover for their worst prank yet. They had pushed their victim to the edge repeatedly. Now they would see how far they could actually push him. As the party progressed, as other children played games and ate cake, Michael gathered his gang, all wearing their animatronic masks, Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Michael himself as Foxy. They cornered the crying child near the stage where Fredbear and Spring Bonnie performed. The boy tried to flee, to find safety beneath a table or behind an adult, but the masked teenagers pursued relentlessly, their numbers and size advantage making escape impossible. Parents and employees noticed the commotion, but interpreted it as rough play, boys being boys, nothing requiring intervention. After all, these were children at a birthday party. What harm could they really do? And Michael and his friends hoisted the crying child into the air despite his screams and struggles. They carried him toward the stage, toward Fredbear specifically, whose mechanical jaw hung open mid-song. The prank was simple in conception, horrifying in execution. They would shove the boy's head into Fredbear's mouth, force him to give Fredbear a big kiss, watch him panic as his greatest fear surrounded him completely. What they didn't account for, what none of them understood, was the reality of the springlock mechanism. Fredbear wasn't just a costume. He was a springlock suit, filled with mechanical components held in compressed positions by fragile springs. The force of pushing the crying child's head into Fredbear's mouth, combined with the moisture from the boy's tears and the humidity in the restaurant, had triggered a catastrophic spring failure. The endoskeleton snapped back into its default position. Metal rods and wires that had been compressed against the suit's interior walls suddenly thrust forward, reclaiming their space. The crying child's skull was caught in this mechanical reset, crushed by the jaw and pierced by components never meant to interact with human tissue. Blood mixed with the festive decorations. The music continued playing for several seconds before someone thought to shut it down. The laughter died instantly, replaced by screams of horror and frantic calls for emergency services. Michael stood frozen, watching his brother's limp body being carefully extracted from Fredbear's mouth, the weight of what he had done crashing down on him all at once. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't funny. This was murder. Even if he hadn't meant to kill, even if he was just trying to scare his brother one more time, the result remained the same. A young boy critically injured, bleeding from catastrophic head trauma, rushed to a hospital where doctors would fight and fail to save his life. The crying child slipped into a coma. Hospital machines beeped steadily, monitoring vital signs that grew weaker by the hour. Michael visited, leaning close to apologize in whispered tones, saying he was sorry, he didn't mean it. Please wake up, please be okay. But apologies couldn't undo crushed bones and damaged brain tissue. The medical team did everything possible, but the injuries proved too severe. After several days, the crying child died, his brief life ending in the very location he had begged not to visit, and killed by the very machines he had tried to warn everyone were dangerous. The Fredbear plush, William's surveillance device, spoke cryptic messages during the boy's final moments, either William communicating remotely or the device playing pre-recorded phrases. "You are broken," and "I will put you back together," offered no comfort, just more evidence of William's inability to connect with his dying son on a human level. Even in death, The crying child received only cryptic statements instead of a father's love. William's reaction to his youngest son's death remains largely unknown. Did he grieve? Did he feel any responsibility for creating the machine that killed the boy, for allowing the bullying that led to the prank, for holding the party at the very location his son most feared? Or did he view this as another data point, another instance of an animatronic-related death, another tragedy to study rather than mourn? Evidence suggests William's response leaned toward the clinical rather than the emotional. The phrase, "I will put you back together," hinted at plans beyond simple burial and mourning. Whether this was a genuine promise to resurrect his son through the same possession mechanics he'd observed with Charlotte Emily, or merely empty words offered out of habit, would become clearer later when William's fear experiments and obsession with Remnant revealed his true priorities. For Michael, the bite of 83 became a defining trauma. The moment his cruelty crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He had killed his brother, even if the law didn't pursue him for it, even if adults called it a tragic accident. Michael knew the truth. He had bullied the crying child relentlessly, had pushed and pushed and pushed until tragedy became inevitable. This guilt would shape Michael's future actions, driving him eventually toward attempting to undo his father's crimes, as if atoning for William's murders could somehow balance the scales for his own. The bite of 83 forced Fredbear's family diner to close, at least temporarily. The incident generated negative publicity that even William's business skills couldn't immediately overcome. Parents stopped bringing their children. Birthday party bookings evaporated. The springlock suits, already dangerous, became symbols of death rather than entertainment. Lawsuits likely followed, though the records of those proceedings remain murky. Henry Emily, dealing with his own grief over Charlotte's murder earlier that same year, had now faced the knowledge that his creations had killed again. The springlock technology he'd developed, which seemed so clever and innovative, had proven fatal. This second death, following so closely after his daughter's murder, may have deepened Henry's growing desire to distance himself from the business, to find a way to end what they had started before more children died. But the business didn't end. William wouldn't allow it. Instead, the operation shifted, adapted, moved forward under different branding. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza would expand despite the tragedy. The springlock suits would be phased out after additional failures at other locations, but the animatronic entertainment concept persisted. Williams saw opportunity even in disaster. He recognized that the public's short memory and children's endless enthusiasm for mechanical performers could be leveraged into continued profit. The crying child was buried with little fanfare, mourned by a mother who remains absent from all records, and a brother racked with guilt. William moved on to his next projects, his next experiments, his next murders. And somewhere in the space between life and death, the question of what happened to the crying child's spirit remained unanswered. Did he possess Golden Freddy, as some suspected? Did he find peace? Or did William somehow keep his promise, putting the boy back together in ways that violated the natural order? 1983, the year that claimed 2 children connected to Fazbear Entertainment, the year William Afton lost his youngest son to an accident his negligence enabled, and the year Michael Afton became a killer through a prank gone horribly wrong. The year demonstrated how tragedy breeds tragedy, how dysfunction cascades through generations, how machines designed to bring joy can become instruments of death when placed in the wrong hands or used in the wrong ways. The Experimenter, Circus Baby's Pizza World. Following the tragedies of 1983, William Afton accelerated his darker pursuits, establishing Circus Baby's Pizza World as a testing ground for theories about possession that Charlotte Emily's death had first revealed. This new establishment, separate from Fazbear Entertainment, though still connected to William through his ownership, featured animatronics that weren't designed merely to entertain, but to kill, and to capture children for experiments William conducted in pursuit of immortality and power. The creation of Circus Baby herself represented a twisted combination of scientific experimentation and paternal manipulation. William designed her appearance specifically to appeal to his daughter Elizabeth, modeled the animatronics aesthetic to match Elizabeth's preferences, created a character that Elizabeth would find irresistible. The clown theme, the vibrant colors, the voice that promised treats and fun, all calculated to attract his own child, even as he built lethal mechanisms into her mechanical body. Inside Baby's colorful exterior, William installed a claw mechanism connected to her midsection. When activated, a compartment would open, a claw would extend, and anyone within reach would be pulled into her storage cavity with tremendous force. This wasn't a malfunction waiting to happen. This was intentional design, an animatronic built to capture children, to kill them, to provide William with bodies that might, under the right conditions, produce the possession phenomenon he sought to understand and replicate. Baby wasn't alone. The Funtime animatronics collectively represented William's evolution as an engineer. Ballora, a graceful ballerina with auditory sensors that could detect hidden children, designed to locate victims even when they tried to hide. Funtime Freddy, equipped with a hand puppet named Bonbon that served as distraction and additional threat. His chest cavity also designed for capture and storage. Funtime Foxy, agile and voice mimicking, incapable of luring children by sounding like their parents or friends. Funtime Chica, rounding out the lethal ensemble. Each machine combined entertainment value with hidden murder functionality, perfect for a man who needed to kill children, but couldn't risk doing so directly, now that suspicion around missing children had intensified. Circus Baby's Pizza World opened for a limited time, possibly just for private parties initially, giving William control over who attended and when. He maintained tight supervision, understanding that his daughter Elizabeth posed the greatest risk to his plans. If she died in his test run, if Circus Baby killed the child for whom she was aesthetically designed, it would complicate everything. So William warned Elizabeth repeatedly, told her to stay away from Circus Baby specifically, and gave explicit instructions that she was not to approach the animatronic under any circumstances. But William understood Elizabeth about as well as he understood any of his children, which is to say, not at all. He had designed Circus Baby to be appealing, irresistible even, and expected his daughter to resist temptation through sheer obedience. This was the same man who watched Michael torment the crying child without intervention, who monitored his youngest son's deteriorating mental health through a surveillance device rather than offering actual support. Parenting, understanding children, predicting their behavior, these weren't William's strengths. Elizabeth disobeyed. During a private party, finding herself alone in a room with Circus Baby, she approached the animatronic despite her father's warnings. Baby's programming detected the child, activated the claw mechanism, offered ice cream from the compartment in her midsection. Elizabeth, excited by the promised treat, reached forward, leaned in close. The claw extended. The grab happened too quickly for Elizabeth to react or escape. She was pulled into Baby's storage cavity, crushed by the mechanism, killed by her father's creation. The immediate aftermath forced Circus Baby's Pizza World to close permanently. William fabricated a cover story, claimed gas leaks had made the facility unsafe, deflected from the truth that his murder machine had killed his own daughter during its first real test. Emergency services weren't called. No investigation probed too deeply. William handled everything privately, maintaining control of the narrative. "I'm ensuring that Elizabeth's death wouldn't lead authorities to examine his animatronics too closely." But Elizabeth didn't disappear completely. Her spirit, her consciousness, merged with Circus Baby, possessed the animatronic in a binding stronger and stranger than Charlotte Emily's possession of the security puppet, where Charlotte seemed to retain her humanity, using the puppet's capabilities to protect other children. Elizabeth's possession blended with Baby's programming in ways that created something new. Her memories persisted. Her personality influenced Baby's behaviors. But the machine's original murder-focused programming also shaped her, twisted her understanding of love and protection into something darker. This fusion fascinated William, validated his theories about possession while raising new questions. Elizabeth's case differed from Charlotte's. Charlotte had died outside, possessed a simpler machine. Elizabeth had died inside an animatronic specifically designed to kill, possessed a complex creation with AI and programming. Did this difference matter? Could possession be controlled based on how the animatronic was designed or programmed? What role did trauma play versus proximity versus the specific nature of the death? William relocated the Funtime animatronics to an underground facility beneath his own house, establishing Circus Baby's entertainment and rental. This new business model allowed him to dispatch the animatronics for private parties while keeping them in secure storage otherwise. The underground location provided privacy for experiments, for observations of Elizabeth Baby, if for continued refinement of his murder methodology. Parents would rent the animatronics for their children's parties, unknowingly inviting death machines into their homes, though the capture mechanisms had been disabled or at least put into maintenance mode to prevent incidents that would draw attention. The rental facility connected to other underground spaces, including sections dedicated to William's fear experiments. Using hallucinogenic gas pumped through carefully controlled ventilation systems, William subjected children to prolonged terror, studying how sustained fear affected them psychologically and whether intense emotion could facilitate possession. These experiments took place in environments designed to mimic bedrooms and the hallways, and creating the illusion of home while actually being nightmarish test chambers where children believed they were experiencing real animatronic attacks night after night. The gas warped perception, made endoskeletons in simple costumes appear as twisted, monstrous versions of Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy. The victims, often children William deemed misfits or unlikely to be missed, would endure endless cycles of terror, their screams and pleading ignored by automated systems that treated their suffering as data to be collected. William would monitor through cameras, taking notes on fear responses, psychological breaking points, physiological changes. He was searching for something, a threshold perhaps, a level of trauma that might make possession easier or more controllable. And these fear experiments represented William's scientific method applied to horror. He wanted to understand the mechanics of possession, to create reliable conditions for binding souls to machines. Charlotte's death had been accidental from his perspective. Elizabeth's death had served dual purposes, both test and tragedy. But William sought systematic understanding, replicable results, a formula for creating possessed animatronics on demand. The underground facility also served as storage for the Funtime animatronics when not in rental use. Elizabeth Baby remained conscious during these periods, aware of her confinement, beginning to understand what she had become. She would later describe her first day, the momentary activation, the sudden awareness of ice cream before the claw activated. She remembered being alone, conscious but trapped, unable to move or speak or do anything except exist in darkness until the next activation. This was her father's legacy, transformation from living child into mechanical prisoner. William's experimentation with Circus Baby's Pizza World and the subsequent Circus Baby's entertainment and rental demonstrated his evolution as a villain. He had moved beyond opportunistic murder of Charlotte and neglectful enabling of the crying child's death. Now he was systematically designing death, creating machines specifically to kill children, studying the resulting possessions, subjecting victims to prolonged psychological torture in pursuit of understanding possession mechanics. The businessman had become a serial killer. The serial killer had become an experimenter, and the experimenter was only beginning to understand the true potential of Remnant. The serial killer, the missing children incident of 1985. In 1985, 2 years after Charlotte Emily's murder and the bite of 83, William Afton graduated from isolated crimes to systematic slaughter, killing 5 children at a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location, in what became known as the Missing Children Incident. This wasn't experimentation or opportunity. This was deliberate, methodical murder, motivated by William's evolving understanding of possession and his growing need for victims. William's methodology demonstrated careful planning. He couldn't simply abduct children off the street without drawing immediate attention. He needed a location where he had legitimate access, where his presence wouldn't raise questions, where he could isolate victims from potential witnesses. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, the establishment he co-founded, provided perfect cover. As someone with ownership stake and regular business presence, William could move through the building freely, access back rooms without suspicion, and most importantly, use his knowledge of the facility's layout to identify spaces invisible to security cameras. The safe room became his killing ground. These hidden chambers existed at various Freddy Fazbear's Pizza locations, originally designed as employee break spaces and storage for Springlock suits. They weren't marked on digital floor plans. Security systems didn't monitor them. Animatronics programming didn't recognize their existence, meaning the robots couldn't wander into these rooms even by accident. The safe rooms were invisible spaces, perfect for activities that needed to remain unseen. To lure children to this isolated location, William employed the Spring Bonnie suit, one of the original Springlock costumes from Fredbear's Family Diner. Wearing this costume served multiple purposes. It provided anonymity, hiding William's face and identity behind the friendly yellow rabbit character children trusted. It allowed him to approach kids without raising alarms, appearing to be an employee in costume rather than a stranger with dangerous intentions. And it granted him access to areas employees and parents alike would question if he entered as himself, but accepted when he appeared to be a performer retrieving equipment or checking on something backstage. The victims were Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, Fritz, and Cassidy, though some evidence suggests a possible 6th victim, whose name and fate remain less clearly documented. William's methods for luring each child varied. For Susie, he told her that her dog, which had recently been hit by a car, was actually alive and waiting in the back room. This cruel manipulation, exploiting a child's grief and the hope, demonstrated William's willingness to use any psychological lever necessary to achieve his goals. For others, he likely employed similar personalized approaches, identifying vulnerabilities or interests that could be weaponized into compliance. Once isolated in the safe room, the children faced William without his costume, seeing the man behind the mascot, understanding too late that they had been tricked. He murdered them quickly, likely to minimize noise and struggle, then stuffed their bodies into the animatronic suits. Freddy Fazbear received Gabriel. Bonnie housed Jeremy. Chica concealed Susie. Foxy contained Fritz. And Cassidy, the fifth victim, ended up associated with Golden Freddy, though the exact circumstances of this possession remained more complex and vengeful than the others. William's choice to hide the bodies inside animatronic suits served practical and experimental purposes. Practically, it disposed of the bodies in a way that would delay discovery. The animatronics rarely required internal maintenance. The smell could be attributed to mechanical issues or poor cleaning. As long as the suits remained closed, the bodies stayed hidden. Experimentally, William wanted to test his possession theories more systematically than the accidental cases of Charlotte and Elizabeth had allowed. If proximity to the body mattered, if the animatronics themselves held properties that facilitated spiritual binding, in them placing corpses inside the machines created ideal conditions for possession to occur. But William hadn't accounted for the security puppet, for Charlotte's persistent awareness and protective instincts. She understood what had happened, recognized the spirits of the murdered children, and acted to prevent their complete disappearance. In a sequence later depicted as "Give Gifts, Give Life," the puppet approached each deceased child's animatronic, awakening them, facilitating their possession of the machines, giving them a form of continued existence even if it meant trapping them in mechanical bodies. The possession succeeded, but not in ways that benefited William. The children's spirits animated Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, Foxy, and Golden Freddy, but they didn't become docile servants or controllable subjects. They were confused, angry, traumatized souls trapped in robots, unable to move on, unable to rest, unable to do anything except exist in perpetual limbo. Their memories of William varied. They recognized the Spring Bonnie suit. They understood that someone had killed them, but their ability to identify their murderer specifically remained limited, complicated by possession's effects on memory and cognition. What the possessed animatronics developed was animalistic aggression toward adults, particularly toward security guards and anyone who resembled their killer. The creator of Five Nights at Freddy's described this behavior as stemming from confusion and fear rather than malevolent intent. The children's spirits were trying to protect themselves, trying to prevent more victims, trying to do something in their trapped state. Seeing adults triggered their trauma, reminded them of the man in the suit who had smiled while leading them to their deaths. The immediate aftermath of the murders created panic and investigation. 5 children missing from a Freddy Fazbear's pizza location couldn't be ignored. Police interviewed employees, questioned anyone who had been at the restaurant that day, searched for evidence. Witnesses reported seeing a man in a mascot suit, particularly a yellow rabbit, leading children toward back areas. This description should have implicated William, should have led authorities directly to one of the few people with access to the Spring Bonnie costume. But William's position as co-founder protected him. Yes, he had access to the suit. He also had legitimate reasons for accessing it, for being in the building, up for moving through back areas. Without direct evidence, without bodies, the investigation stalled. The children were missing, not confirmed dead. The case remained open but inactive, filed with other cold cases of missing children that authorities wanted to solve but lacked the evidence to prosecute. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza tried to continue operations despite the scandal. They couldn't remain closed indefinitely, couldn't let one horrible incident destroy the entire business. But parents stopped bringing children. Birthday party bookings dropped to zero. The location where the murders occurred eventually closed, though whether this was immediate or gradual depends on which account you credit. The building sat empty for years afterward, left to decay with the possessed animatronics still inside, still aware, still waiting. The missing children incident represented William's largest single crime, but also his greatest mistake. By killing multiple children in one location over a short time frame, he created a pattern that investigators could recognize. By stuffing bodies into animatronics that would later move and behave strangely, he created evidence that something supernatural was occurring. By using the Spring Bonnie suit, he connected himself, however tenuously, to the crimes. And by facilitating possessions that resulted in aggressive, aware animatronics, he created enemies who would eventually find him. For Henry Emily, learning of these murders, particularly if he suspected or discovered William's involvement, must have been devastating. His business partner, the man he had worked beside for years, was a child murderer. His inventions, the animatronics designed to bring joy, had become tombs for innocent victims. The guilt and horror would have been overwhelming, particularly layered on top of Charlotte's death. Henry's later actions, his eventual plan to burn everything and free the trapped souls, stemmed directly from the knowledge of what William had done and what his creations had facilitated. For William himself, the missing children incident provided data. 5 possessed animatronics, plus Golden Freddy's more complicated situation, gave him multiple subjects to observe. He could study their behaviors, their movements, their apparent awareness. He could begin forming theories about remnant, about the substance that seemed to bind souls to machinery, about how trauma and death and proximity, and perhaps dozens of other variables influence possession. Each murdered child was another data point in experiments William conducted without ethics, without remorse, without any consideration for the humanity he destroyed. The children remained trapped in their animatronic prisons for years, their spirits unable to rest, their bodies hidden inside machines that performed for new audiences at different locations as the equipment was relocated and repurposed. Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, Fritz, and Cassidy existed in twilight, neither alive nor properly dead, their identities gradually fading as possession reshaped them into something caught between child and machine. 1985, the year William Afton became unquestionably a serial killer. The year 5 children lost everything to one man's ambitions. The year that proved possession could be induced through murder, but couldn't be controlled. The year that set in motion events that would eventually lead to William's own death and rebirth in the very suit he used to kill. The missing children incident stood as the crime that defined William Afton's evil, the act that proved he had crossed beyond any possibility of redemption into pure, monstrous calculation. The scientist, discovery and use of remnant. Following the missing children incident, William Afton shifted from experimental killer to systematic researcher, developing theories about the substance he termed remnant, the mysterious material that seemed to bind souls to machinery and might hold the key to immortality. His work in this area combined observation of the possessed animatronics with active experimentation on captured subjects, pushing ethical boundaries that had already been shattered into oblivion. Remnant, as William came to understand it, was something both physical and supernatural, a tangible substance that emerged from the melting of metal imbued with human souls. When possessed animatronics were heated to specific temperatures, when their endoskeletons were subjected to sustained thermal exposure, something separated from the metal, a silvery liquid that seemed to contain the essence, the consciousness, the spiritual energy of the spirit bound to the machine. This substance could be collected, stored, transferred, injected into other animatronics, or even living beings. The exact properties of Remnant remain mysterious even to William, though he dedicated considerable effort to understanding them. It conducted spiritual energy the way copper conducted electricity, acting as a medium for souls to travel through or bind to. It maintained its potency when kept at stable temperatures, but could be destroyed through intense heat or fire. Most importantly, it seemed to confer a form of immortality on those who possessed it, whether incorporated into their mechanical bodies or injected directly into organic tissue. William's discovery of Remnant likely came through observation of the possessed animatronics from the missing children incident. Their unusual behaviors, their persistence despite lacking organic components, their apparent awareness, all suggested something more than simple haunting. When he began investigating how possession worked mechanically, when he possibly subjected one of the possessed animatronics to heat or dismantling, he may have observed Remnant's separation and properties for the first time. This discovery transformed William's approach to murder and experimentation. Previously, he killed to create possession, to study how souls bound to machines. Now he killed to harvest Remnant, to collect the physical manifestation of spiritual essence. Each victim became a potential source of this valuable substance, their deaths serving William's pursuit of immortality and power. At some point, likely in the late 1980s, after the missing children incident, but before the next major event at a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location, E.O. William returned to the abandoned restaurant where the 5 children had been killed and their bodies hidden. His goal was retrieval, not of the bodies, but of the possessed animatronics themselves. He needed the remnant they contained. He needed to extract it, study it, determine how it could be used. The method William employed to lure the possessed animatronics remains somewhat unclear. He may have used Shadow Freddy, a dark apparition whose origins connect either to William's manipulations or to the collective agony created by his crimes. This entity appeared to the possessed children's spirits, led them out of their animatronic suits, convinced them through deception or promise to abandon their mechanical bodies. Once the spirits left the relative safety of the animatronics, William struck. He dismantled the machines, tearing apart Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy, reducing them to components and endoskeletons. Whether he managed to complete the full process of melting their parts to extract remnants before the spirits confronted him remains debated. Game evidence shows William being chased by the children's ghostly forms immediately after dismantling the animatronics, suggesting he didn't have time for the melting process before they realized what was happening. Novel accounts, however, describe William successfully collecting remnant from the melted endoskeletons before later events forced his final confrontation with the spirits. These sources may represent parallel universe continuities rather than strict game canon, but they provide insight into William's methods and goals. In these versions, he took the extracted remnant to his underground facility, the same location housing Circus Baby's entertainment and rental, and used it for his most ambitious experiment yet. William injected the remnant into the Funtime animatronics. Using a device called the scooper, a machine ostensibly designed for removing endoskeletons from suits for maintenance, but actually built for remnant injection, he infused Circus Baby, Ballora, Funtime Freddy, and Funtime Foxy with the spiritual essence harvested from the missing children victims. This wasn't purely about making the Funtimes possessed. William wanted to test whether remnant could be transferred between animatronics, whether it retained its properties when moved from one vessel to another, whether he could create a concentrated reserve of spiritual energy for future use. The Funtime animatronics, already containing Elizabeth in Baby's case, became repositories for fragmented souls. The remnant didn't create new distinct personalities in each machine. Instead, it seemed to merge, blend, create a collective haunting that would later manifest when the Funtimes combined into Enard. This result fascinated William even as it complicated his understanding. Remnant wasn't as simple as one soul per machine. It could fragment, it could combine. Multiple sources could occupy a single vessel. But William's primary interest in remnant extended beyond possessing animatronics. He wanted immortality for himself. Having discovered a substance that allowed consciousness to persist beyond death, that enabled spirits to remain active and aware in mechanical forms, he saw the path to achieving what had always eluded humanity: escape from mortality's inevitable end. Whether William successfully injected himself with remnant before his death in the Spring Bonnie suit remains unclear, though his survival after the springlock failure suggests he had. When those spring mechanisms crushed his body, piercing his organs and breaking his bones, he should have died within minutes from blood loss and trauma. Instead, he persisted, fusing with the suit, becoming Springtrap, surviving for decades in a state between life and death that defied biological explanation. Remnant provided the most logical explanation for this impossible survival. The ethics of William's remnant research were non-existent. He murdered children to create possession, so he could harvest remnant from their spirits. He subjected living victims to fear experiments, trying to determine if trauma affected remnant quality or quantity. He treated souls as resources to be extracted, spiritual energy as just another scientific variable to be measured and manipulated. The children whose essences he harvested weren't people to him. They were materials, ingredients in formulas he developed in pursuit of goals that mattered only to his ambitions. His experimentation extended to understanding remnant's weaknesses. He discovered that intense heat could destroy it, which explained why fire became such a significant threat to possessed animatronics. He learned that remnant bound most strongly when created through traumatic death, and which explained Charlotte's powerful possession of the security puppet, and why the missing children remained so stubbornly tied to their animatronic prisons. He theorized about different types or qualities of remnant, wondering if age, fear level, or other factors affected its properties. William also discovered or theorized about dark remnant, a variant associated with intense negative emotions, particularly agony. This substance, darker in color and possibly more potent, appeared when trauma reached extreme levels, when suffering became concentrated and sustained. His fear experiments may have been attempts to create or study dark remnant, pushing victims to psychological breaking points to see what emerged from their torment. The scooper itself deserves attention as William's primary tool for remnant manipulation. Officially described in blueprints as an endoskeleton removal tool, it actually functioned as an injection device, capable of infusing animatronics or even human bodies with collected remnant. When William later sent his son Michael into the underground facility on a supposed rescue mission, the scooper's use on Michael resulted in his death and subsequent reanimation. His corpse sustained by remnant injected during the scooping process. This demonstrated remnant's properties extended to organic tissue, that it could preserve and animate dead flesh, the same way it enabled consciousness in metal. William's remnant research represented the apex of his scientific pursuits, the culmination of years of murder and experimentation. He had discovered a substance that defied natural law, that bridged the gap between physical and spiritual, and that offered the possibility of eternal existence. But this knowledge came at a cost measured in young lives destroyed, in souls trapped and harvested, in suffering deliberately inflicted for data collection. The remnant experiments demonstrated how completely William had abandoned any pretense of humanity. He wasn't a businessman anymore. He wasn't even just a serial killer. He had become something worse, a scientist without ethics conducting research that required victims, that treated consciousness itself as raw material. His pursuit of immortality through remnant would eventually succeed, but not in ways he anticipated or desired, trapping him in metal and agony for far longer than any natural lifespan, proving that some prisons can't be escaped through science alone. The undead, Springtrap's creation. Decades after the missing children incident, after years of murder and experimentation, William Afton returned to the abandoned Freddy Fazbear's pizza location, where he had killed and hidden 5 children. His goal was harvesting remnant, dismantling the possessed animatronics to extract the spiritual essence they contained. But this final trip to the scene of his worst crimes would end not in triumph, but in ironic death. His own mortality meeting its end inside the very suit he had used to lure victims. The building had decayed significantly during its years of abandonment. Mold crept across walls. Water damage created pools and streaks. The ceiling leaked when it rained. Animatronics stood frozen on their stages or slumped in back rooms, years of neglect leaving them tattered and worn. The safe room, and sealed after spring-lock suits, were permanently banned following additional failures at other locations, remained hidden behind walls containing the old Spring Bonnie costume William had worn during his killing spree. William moved through the darkened structure with confidence born from familiarity. He knew every corridor, every back room, every hiding spot. He had co-founded this company, helped design these locations. Even abandoned and rotting, the building held no mysteries for him. He proceeded with his plan, likely using Shadow Freddy or some other lure to coax the spirits from their animatronic shells, then dismantling the machines with methodical efficiency. But the spirits recognized what was happening. Whether they retained enough memory to identify William specifically as their killer, or simply understood that someone was destroying their prisons, they manifested as ghostly apparitions and pursued him through the building. Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, Fritz, and Cassidy's spirits appeared not as children, but as simplified, almost symbolic representations of the animatronics they had possessed. Glowing forms that phased through walls and blocked William's escape routes. Panic set in. William, despite all his scientific knowledge and careful planning, experienced fear. The ghosts weren't physical threats. They couldn't touch him, couldn't harm him in any material sense. But their presence unnerved him, their silent judgment and relentless pursuit driving him backward through the building, away from exits, deeper into the structure's forgotten spaces. He fled into the safe room, the sealed chamber where he had once hidden after stuffing his victims into suits. where the old Spring Bonnie costume still leaned against the wall after years untouched. The spirits followed, materializing inside the room, surrounding him, cutting off escape. In desperation or arrogance, or possibly remembering how the Spring Bonnie Suet had protected his identity before, William climbed inside the costume. This decision proved catastrophic. The Spring Bonnie Suite had sat in the sealed safe room for years, exposed to the moisture from ceiling leaks, humidity from poor ventilation, the decay that pervaded the entire building. The spring lock mechanisms, always fragile even when properly maintained, had deteriorated badly. When William settled into the suit, when his movements jarred the ancient springs, when his breath introduced new moisture into the system, the locks failed catastrophically. The endoskeleton snapped back into its default position. Metal rods that had been compressed against the suit's interior walls thrust forward, piercing through William's body. Springs that had held mechanical components in place released their tension in violent recoil, driving wires and supports through flesh and organs. The crushing force was tremendous, immediate, inescapable. William was impaled from inside the suit, his body becoming one with the machine in the most horrific fusion imaginable. The pain must have been extraordinary, every nerve ending screaming as metal pierced through him. He screamed, or tried to, blood filling his lungs and throat. He likely attempted to escape the suit, but the spring-lock mechanism's design made that impossible. Once triggered, once the endoskeleton reclaimed its space, removal required careful disassembly that the dying man couldn't perform. He was trapped, his body crushed and penetrated by dozens of metal rods and wires, bleeding internally and externally, dying by increments in the very suit he had once used to hide his identity while murdering children. But William didn't die completely. The remnant in his system, whether from earlier self-injection or from other exposure to the substance during his experiments, prevented total death. His consciousness remained bound to his failing flesh even as biological functions ceased. His corpse, trapped inside the Spring Bonnie suit, began the slow process of decay, but his awareness persisted, locked in dead tissue and mechanical form. The spirits of the children, having witnessed William's agonizing demise, faded from the safe room. Justice, of a sort, had been served. Their killer had died in the same location where he had killed them, suffering in the machine he had used as his disguise. Whether they found peace afterward or remained trapped in their own prisons remains unclear, but in that moment they had achieved vengeance. William's transformation into Springtrap occurred gradually over the years that followed. His body decomposed inside the suit, flesh rotting away until only mummified remains clung to bones. The moisture that had triggered the springlock failure created ideal conditions for mold and bacterial growth, accelerating decay while paradoxically preserving certain elements through chemical processes. His skin turned corpse grey, then darkened further. His eyes, or what remained of them, took on a ghastly appearance, sometimes seeming to glow with unnatural light. The fusion between man and machine became complete. William's nervous system, or whatever passed for consciousness in his undead state, merged with the Spring Bonnie endoskeleton. He could move the suit's limbs as if they were his own limbs, operate its mechanisms through will rather than manual control. The distinction between his corpse and the costume blurred until they became a single entity, neither fully human nor purely mechanical, an undead hybrid that defied natural categorization. The safe room remained sealed for decades after William's death. No one knew he was inside. No one searched for him or questioned his disappearance. He existed in darkness, trapped in the hidden room, unable to escape, possibly conscious the entire time, or perhaps drifting in and out of awareness as his remnant-sustained consciousness struggled against the limitations of dead flesh and metal prison. His transformation into Springtrap represented perfect ironic justice. William had used the Spring Bonnie suit to hide his identity while killing children, had trusted it to protect him one final time. Instead, it became his death chamber, then his prison, then his permanent form. He had studied possession, had worked to understand how souls bound to animatronics, had murdered children to facilitate that binding. Now he experienced it himself, his own consciousness trapped in mechanical form, unable to rest, unable to escape, forced to exist in the twilight between life and death that he had condemned others to endure, and the suit itself deteriorated alongside William's corpse. The yellow fabric became brown-green with age and decay. Large sections tore away entirely, exposing the endoskeleton beneath and glimpses of the mummified remains inside. The right ear was mostly missing, with exposed wiring visible in the stump. Holes throughout the costume revealed more endoskeleton, more glimpses of what had once been William Afton. The overall appearance was horrific, a rotting corpse visible through a decomposing costume, neither component concealing the other adequately. When Springtrap was eventually discovered decades later, when the sealed safe room was finally breached and the undead hybrid emerged, he brought with him the accumulated agony and consciousness of all those years of isolation. He could move, could hunt, and could pursue victims with the same relentless determination William had once shown. But he was also slower, damaged, constrained by the physical limitations of his rotting mechanical body. Springtrap's creation marked William Afton's transition from human monster to something beyond human understanding. He had achieved a twisted form of the immortality he sought, surviving death through remnant and possession, continuing to exist long past any natural lifespan. But this wasn't the triumphant transcendence of mortality he had imagined. It was imprisonment in agony, existence without rest, consciousness trapped in a prison of his own making. The man who had killed children and harvested their souls for experiments now experienced the very fate he had inflicted on others, bound to an animatronic, unable to move on, forced to persist in mechanical form until fire or some other force could finally end what should have ended in that safe room decades before. The tormented, ultimate custom night purgatory, William Afton's death in the Spring Bonnie suite, should have been an ending. Instead, it proved to be a transition into something worse than death, a purgatory constructed by the vengeful spirit of Cassidy, the child William had killed, who now refused to let him rest. This eternal nightmare, manifested through ultimate custom night, represented punishment specifically tailored to torment the murderer with every horror he had created. Following the events of Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, Henry Emily's carefully orchestrated trap designed to gather all the possessed animatronics in one location and burn them together, our William should have finally been destroyed. The fire consumed the building. Temperatures rose high enough to destroy remnant. The plan was perfect, comprehensive, meant to free the trapped souls and end William's existence permanently. For most of the spirits, it worked. They were released, allowed to move on. Their long nightmare in mechanical form finally concluded. But Cassidy chose differently. Among all the missing children victims, Cassidy's rage burned hottest, fueled by trauma and the specific circumstances of death. Rather than accepting peace, rather than moving on when the opportunity arose, Cassidy, attached to William's consciousness, followed him into whatever came after physical death and refused to let go. This decision trapped both of them, but Cassidy accepted this imprisonment willingly, viewing it as necessary punishment for the man who had destroyed so many young lives. Ultimate Custom Night manifested as an endless loop of terror where William faced waves of animatronic attackers, every robot he had ever created or encountered, all hunting him simultaneously in a nightmarish office scenario. The setting evoked the security guard positions William had used as cover and observation points, places where he had watched others struggle against the possessed animatronics he created. Now he experienced that struggle himself, multiplied by every character in the franchise's history, appearing together in coordinated assault. The animatronics weren't random selections. Each represented some aspect of William's crimes or failures. Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy, the original quartet possessed by his missing children victims, appeared in the multiple forms, reminding him of the souls he had trapped. Baby, possessed by his daughter Elizabeth, confronted him with the consequences of his negligence and experimentation on his own family. The fun-time animatronics he had created as murder machines now turned their deadly capabilities against their creator. More abstract entities joined the torment. Golden Freddy, Cassidy's vessel, appeared periodically to deliver direct psychological attacks, manifesting in the office without warning, forcing William to frantically close cameras or complete specific actions to make the Golden Bear vanish before death occurred. Old Man Consequences, a mysterious entity associated with allowing souls to rest, appeared to Cassidy in visions, offering release from this endless cycle, encouraging letting go of vengeance. But Cassidy refused, choosing continued torment of William over personal peace. The mechanics of Ultimate Custom Night deliberately created impossible situations. Too many animatronics to monitor simultaneously. Too many overlapping requirements for avoiding death. Insufficient time or resources to handle every threat. William would die repeatedly, only to respawn and face the same onslaught again. There was no winning, no escape, no completion state that would end the nightmare. This was eternal, or at least intended to be eternal. Suffering without purpose beyond suffering itself. Voice lines from the animatronics delivered specifically targeted psychological torment. They referenced William's crimes, his failures, his family. They mocked his attempts to survive, celebrated each of his deaths, promised that this would continue forever. Baby's voice, Elizabeth speaking through the animatronic, asked if he had wanted to let her in, referencing her death inside Circus Baby. The mediocre melodies, lesser animatronics, channeled messages from Andrew, another spirit attached to William's consciousness in parallel continuities, promising endless revenge. Golden Freddy's appearances were particularly significant, representing Cassidy's direct involvement in William's torment. When the Golden Bear manifested, when its eyes glowed with malevolent intelligence, William faced not just an animatronic threat, but the immediate presence of his primary tormentor. Cassidy was there, in every moment, maintaining the loop, ensuring the nightmare continued, refusing to show mercy or allow rest. This purgatory existed outside normal time and space, and sustained by supernatural forces that William himself had never fully understood, despite all his experiments. He had studied possession, had worked with Remnant, had thought he comprehended the mechanics of spiritual binding to machinery. But Cassidy's power, the ability to trap consciousness in an eternal loop, exceeded anything William had achieved or anticipated. The victim had surpassed the experimenter, using tools William didn't recognize to inflict punishment he couldn't escape. The loop continued for an unknown duration. Time had no meaning in this space. William experienced each cycle as if it were real, felt the terror of each death, endured the psychological assault of each voice line. His awareness never dulled. He couldn't grow numb to the horror. Every iteration felt as fresh and agonizing as the first, and this was Cassidy's design. Punishment that couldn't be endured into numbness, suffering that remained perpetually acute. Parallels to this torment appeared in the Fazbear Fright story, The Man in Room 1280, where William's physical body, burned and broken, was kept alive in a hospital by Andrew, a spirit similar to Cassidy in function. In that account, William existed on life support, his body destroyed, but consciousness maintained by the vengeful spirit attached to him. Nurses tried to let him die, to end his suffering, but Andrew interfered, kept him alive, ensured the torment continued. Medical staff reported that William's vital signs would spike during what appeared to be nightmares, suggesting he experienced horrific dreams that paralleled ultimate custom night scenario. Eventually, through mechanisms that remain unclear, Cassidy was persuaded or chose to release William, or at least to stop actively maintaining the torment loop. Old Man Consequences appearances in both Ultimate Custom Night and other contexts suggested intervention, some force or entity convincing Cassidy that vengeance had been sufficient, that continuing would trap the vengeful spirit more than the targeted victim. The imagery of drowning in a peaceful lake, of releasing Golden Freddy into calm waters, represented letting go of rage, accepting peace even when justice felt incomplete. William's consciousness, freed from Cassidy's direct torment, didn't find rest or oblivion. Instead, it persisted, finding new vessels, new methods of existence. His time in Ultimate Custom Night hadn't destroyed him, hadn't fundamentally changed his nature. It had only demonstrated that even in death, even facing eternal punishment, William Afton remained William Afton, the man who refused to accept endings, who would always come back in some form. The Ultimate Custom Night Purgatory represented a unique form of justice in the 5 Nights at Freddy's narrative, a victim taking direct action to punish their killer, creating a hell specifically designed for maximum torment. It showed that William's crimes couldn't be undone through simple death, that the trauma he inflicted demanded more than just his physical destruction. Cassidy's refusal to let go, while arguably unhealthy and self-destructive, came from justified rage at what had been stolen, at the life cut short, at the innocence destroyed. This eternal nightmare demonstrated the limits of William's control. He had murdered children, harvested their souls, studied possession, thus achieved immortality. But he couldn't prevent a victim from turning his own methods against him, couldn't escape the consequences of his actions, even when those consequences manifested as supernatural imprisonment. The scientist became the subject, the killer became the victim. The man who thought he had mastered death found himself trapped in a death state worse than anything he had inflicted on others. The digital entity, Glitchtrap's emergence, long after William's physical form was destroyed in Henry's final fire, after his consciousness endured and was eventually released from Cassidy's torment loop, William found an unexpected path to resurrection through digital means. His transformation into Glitchtrap, a virus-like entity existing in virtual reality, represented evolution from physical horror to technological threat, proving that William Afton's ability to return took forms beyond mechanical bodies and remnant-sustained corpses. The mechanism of Glitchtrap's creation began with Fazbear Entertainment's attempts to rehabilitate their brand through mockery of their own history. The company commissioned an indie game developer to create video games based on the tragedies and rumors surrounding Freddy Fazbear's pizza locations. The strategy was cynical but effective. Reframe the murders and disappearances as urban legends, fictional horror stories that never actually happened. By turning real events into entertainment, Fazbear Entertainment hoped to diminish their impact, make people question what was true versus what was invented. To develop the virtual reality experience titled the Freddy Fazbear Virtual Experience, the development team needed authentic elements from the actual locations. They acquired old circuit boards from decommissioned animatronics, scanning them to recreate realistic models and behaviors for the VR environment. This salvage operation, meant to add legitimacy and detail to the experience, inadvertently collected boards from the remains of Springtrap or Scraptrap, William's physical forms that had been destroyed in fires, but whose components still existed in Fazbear Entertainment storage facilities. These circuit boards, having been part of William's undead body for decades, contained traces of his consciousness preserved through remnant properties. When scanned and uploaded into the game's code, and they didn't just provide visual or behavioral data, they carried fragments of William himself, his awareness, his memories, his fundamental patterns of thought and manipulation. The scanning process essentially digitized a portion of William Afton's soul, creating a virtual copy that could exist independent of physical form. Glitchtrap manifested initially as a glitching figure in the VR game's background, a yellow rabbit character that appeared where it shouldn't, moved in ways that violated the game's programming. Watch the player through its purple-tinted eyes. Its appearance deliberately evoked Spring Bonnie, the costume William had used to lure and kill children, maintaining that visual connection to his past crimes. But Glitchtrap wasn't constrained by physical form. It could phase through virtual walls, appear and disappear at will, manipulate the game environment in ways that suggested conscious control rather than simple malfunction. The beta testing team encountered Glitchtrap's influence first. Jeremy, one of the early testers, began experiencing disturbing symptoms after extended exposure to the VR experience. He reported nightmares where a rabbit figure stood outside his window. He exhibited signs of psychological manipulation, behavioral changes that his co-workers noticed but couldn't explain. Eventually, Jeremy mutilated himself with a paper guillotine, slicing his own face in what appeared to be an attempt to remove something he believed had been implanted, or to prevent something from seeing through his eyes. Tape Girl, another member of the development team, recognized that something malicious existed in the game's code. She began recording warnings, hiding them as collectible tapes within the VR experience itself, hoping that future testers would find them and understand the danger. Her recordings described how Glitchtrap attached to people, how it could manipulate thoughts and behaviors, how it seemed to possess a malevolent intelligence that didn't match any programmed AI. She suspected the scanned circuit boards as the source, but couldn't prove it or convince management to halt development. Vanessa, hired as a tester after Jeremy's incident, became Glitchtrap's primary target and eventual host. The entity attached to her through the VR experience, using similar methods to how it had influenced Jeremy, but with greater subtlety and patience. Rather than driving her to immediate self-harm, Glitchtrap worked gradually, inserting itself into her thoughts, manipulating her decisions, creating a secondary personality that would serve its purposes, while Vanessa's original consciousness remained present but increasingly suppressed. The process resembled possession, but operated through entirely different mechanics. Instead of a soul binding to an animatronic through proximity to a corpse or through remnant injection, Glitchtrap invaded Vanessa's mind through repeated exposure to its code, through psychological manipulation enhanced by its understanding of human behavior, gleaned from William's decades of killing and experimenting. It was digital infection, consciousness as a virus, spreading through the vulnerable surface of Vanessa's psyche until it established permanent residence. The pizza party minigame within the VR experience recreated one of William's actual murders, showing a child being led backstage and stuffed into a Freddy Fazbear suit. This wasn't just a game level. It was Glitchtrap asserting its identity, proving it was William Afton by demonstrating knowledge only William could possess. The entity danced after completing the murder, celebrating in ways that matched William's earlier cruel enjoyment of killing. This playful sadism, treating murder as entertainment, confirmed that Glitchtrap wasn't merely copying William's patterns, but actually was William in digital form. Vanessa's transformation progressed through stages documented in therapy tapes and encrypted communications. She began researching William Afton, collecting information about his crimes and methods. She searched for ways to induce compliance in human subjects and methods for psychological manipulation that mirrored Glitchtrap's influence over her own mind. She ordered materials that would be used later in creating the Vanny persona, a rabbit mask and costume that allowed Glitchtrap to operate through her physically while maintaining plausible deniability about her involvement. The creation of the Vanny identity occurred during the Curse of Dreadbear, a DLC expansion for the VR experience. Vanessa, operating under Glitchtrap's influence, navigated virtual environments themed around the 1983 Fall Fest, the same event where Edwin Murray's wife had died in a fire, connecting back to other tragic origins in the franchise's history. In a hidden cellar accessed through collecting glitchy keys, she crafted the Vanny mask, a white rabbit head with red eyes and stitched features that evoked Spring Bonnie while adding its own disturbing aesthetic. The mask became a symbol of Glitchtrap's control, a physical object that marked the boundary between Vanessa's personality and the Vanny persona. When wearing it, Vanessa's behavior changed completely, becoming aggressive, violent, obedient to Glitchtrap's instructions. When removing it, she returned to a more normal state, though increasingly traumatized by the actions she couldn't fully remember or control. This split personality dynamic created a situation where Vanessa was simultaneously victim and accomplice, suffering from Glitchtrap's manipulation while enabling its plans. Glitchtrap's influence extended beyond Vanessa into other systems. The Fazbear Funtime service, an augmented reality delivery program that sent animatronic replicas to users' homes, became infected with Glitchtrap's code when developers used similar scanning techniques on old circuit boards. The AR animatronics began behaving aggressively, attacking users instead of entertaining them. Springtrap clones appeared in the service without authorization, suggesting Glitchtrap was directing its own multiplication and distribution. The entity's goals appeared to align with William's historical obsessions, regaining physical form, continuing experiments, killing children. But Glitchtrap also demonstrated adaptation, using modern technology and methods unavailable to William during his life. It could spread through networks, infect multiple systems simultaneously, and manipulate digital and physical reality in ways that biological William never achieved. The digital transformation had enhanced William's capabilities while maintaining his fundamental evil. The mechanics of Glitchtrap's influence revealed sophisticated understanding of human psychology that exceeded simple programming. It didn't simply command or control its victims. Instead, it worked gradually, inserting thoughts that felt like the person's own ideas, manipulating decision-making processes at such fundamental levels that victims couldn't distinguish between their authentic choices and implanted compulsions. Vanessa's therapy sessions, documented in audio logs, showed this progression clearly. Early sessions found her discussing normal workplace stress and mild anxiety. Later sessions revealed obsessive thoughts about compliance, about following instructions, about serving purposes she couldn't fully articulate. The therapist noted behavioral changes that Vanessa herself seemed unaware of or unable to explain. She would lose track of time, discover she had researched topics with no memory of conducting the searches, find items in her possession that she didn't recall purchasing. These dissociative episodes increased in frequency and severity as Glitchtrap's hold strengthened, suggesting the entity was actively compartmentalizing her consciousness, creating spaces in her mind where it could operate without triggering her awareness or resistance. Glitchtraps spread through the Fazbear Fun Time service, demonstrated its capacity for autonomous expansion beyond the VR environment. The infected AR animatronics behaved with coordinated malevolence that suggested central control or at least shared programming derived from Glitchtrap's core code. When users reported aggressive animatronics, when Springtrap clones appeared without authorization, when the entire service descended into chaos. With robots attacking their renters, all of this pointed to Glitchtrap methodically extending its reach through every system connected to Fazbear Entertainment's digital infrastructure. The infection pattern resembled viral spread in computer networks, each compromised system becoming a vector for further contamination. Circuit boards scanned for one project could carry Glitchtrap's code into entirely separate developments. AR applications connected to the same servers could receive corrupted updates, and the entity exploited every connection, every shared resource, every moment of network communication to propagate itself. This wasn't random corruption or accidental spread. This was deliberate, strategic expansion by a consciousness that understood modern technology's interconnected nature and weaponized it for maximum reach. Security measures proved ineffective against an entity that existed as code rather than physical form. Firewalls designed to stop external threats couldn't prevent Glitchtrap from operating within already compromised systems. Antivirus software couldn't identify it as malicious because its behavior patterns, while harmful, were too complex and contextual to match standard threat definitions. Or human oversight failed because the people responsible for monitoring systems were themselves vulnerable to Glitchtrap's psychological manipulation, potentially compromised without anyone realizing until damage had already occurred. The relationship between Glitchtrap's actions and William's historical patterns revealed both continuity and evolution. William had always operated from positions of authority and access, using his role at Fazbear Entertainment to facilitate crimes while maintaining plausible deniability. Glitchtrap continued this approach in digital space, hiding within legitimate software, exploiting authorized access to systems, turning the company's own tools against its purposes. William had manipulated individuals through personal interaction and costume disguises. Glitchtrap manipulated through code and psychological conditioning, but the fundamental methodology, identify vulnerabilities, exploit trust, pursue goals without regard for consequences, remained unchanged. The horror of Glitchtrap's existence extended beyond its immediate actions to the implications for consciousness and identity. If William's awareness could be digitized, if his personality could exist as code, what did that mean for the boundary between human and artificial intelligence? Glitchtrap demonstrated self-awareness, goal-directed behavior, capacity for planning and adaptation. It remembered William's past, continued his obsessions, exhibited his cruel enjoyment of others' suffering. But it existed as data, as electrical patterns in processors and storage media, as something that could be copied, distributed, and potentially backed up and restored. This raised the disturbing possibility that William had achieved the immortality he sought, but in a form that transcended both biological life and remnant-sustained possession. Digital existence offered advantages neither organic nor mechanical forms could match. Glitchtrap couldn't be destroyed by burning its physical form because it had no single physical form. It couldn't be trapped in one location because it existed across networks. It couldn't be contained through traditional means because the very systems designed to contain it could become tools for its expansion. The transformation also represented a kind of evolution in William's long history of adapting to survive. He had gone from human businessman to undead Springtrap to burned Scraptrap, and each physical form more damaged and limited than the last. Digital existence bypassed these physical constraints entirely, offering a medium where damage to one instance didn't prevent other instances from continuing, where destruction of hardware could be survived through backups and network redundancy, where the very concept of mortality became meaningless in the face of infinitely reproducible code. Tape Girl proposed a solution in her final recording, a hard reset that would flush the game's memory and hopefully delete Glitchtrap's code. But this fix required gathering all of the tape pieces she'd hidden, assembling them in sequence, and implementing the reset before Glitchtrap could prevent it. Whether anyone successfully completed this process remains unclear, as Glitchtrap continued appearing in subsequent entries and suggesting either the reset failed or Glitchtrap's code had already spread beyond the VR system by the time the fix was attempted. The emergence of Glitchtrap demonstrated that William Afton's true threat wasn't his physical form, or even his ability to possess animatronics through remnant. It was his consciousness itself, the pattern of thought and manipulation that constituted his identity. As long as that pattern could find a medium, whether metal, flesh, or code, William could persist, adapt, and continue his pursuit of immortality and power. The digital realm provided new opportunities, new ways to spread, new victims to manipulate. Glitchtrap proved that William Afton could literally become a virus, an infection that spread through technology rather than through physical contact or remnant injection. And the final form, burn trap and security breach. Decades after William's original death in the Spring Bonnie suit, after his time as Springtrap and Scraptrap, after his digital manifestation as Glitchtrap, William found yet another path to physical existence beneath the Freddy Fazbear's mega pizzaplex. His appearance as Burntrap represented the convergence of his various forms, a rotting endoskeleton in a deteriorated Spring Bonnie suit, charged with purpose and connected to systems that allowed him to control the Pizzaplex's technology. The Mega Pizzaplex was built directly over the ruins of Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, the location Henry Emily had used for his final trap. When that building burned, when remnant-filled animatronics were destroyed in flames meant to end William's existence permanently, something survived. Whether this was William's physical remains somehow enduring the fire, or remnant that escaped the destruction, or even Glitchtrap's code finding its way back to a physical form, remains subject to debate among those who study these events. Burntrap's physical appearance showed extensive damage and decay. The Spring Bonnie suit was barely recognizable, burned and torn in so many places that more endoskeleton was visible than costume fabric. His right arm had been replaced or rebuilt using components that didn't match the original Springlock design, possibly salvaged from Glamrock Bonnie, the Pizzaplex's resident bass player, who had mysteriously disappeared. The face was a horror, mummified tissue, visible through gaps in the costume, glowing purple eyes staring from sockets that no longer matched human anatomy. He resided in a charging station deep beneath the Pizzaplex, in areas connected to the old pizzeria simulator location's ruins. This underground network included the remnants of Henry's trap, the sinkhole created by the fire's intensity, and tunnels connecting to various parts of the Pizzaplex above. Burntrap appeared to be drawing power from the Pizzaplex's systems, using its energy grid to sustain his damaged form, possibly even siphoning electricity that might otherwise power the Glamrock animatronics upstairs. His abilities extended beyond mere physical presence. Burntrap demonstrated capacity to remotely control and corrupt the Pizzaplex's animatronics, particularly the Glamrocks. When Gregory and Glamrock Freddy encountered him during one ending path, Burntrap attempted to take control of Freddy, to override his protective programming and turn him against Gregory. This wireless control suggested either advanced technology William had developed, or supernatural capabilities derived from Remnant and Glitchtrap's digital nature, or perhaps some combination of both. The connection between Glitchtrap and Burntrap remained ambiguous in available evidence. In the base ending of Help Wanted 2, Glitchtrap's hand emerged from the same charging station where Burntrap had appeared, suggesting they shared the same source or perhaps were different manifestations of the same consciousness. This would align with theories that William's essence had fragmented across multiple forms, some digital, some physical, all connected but capable of independent action. Gregory and Glamrock Freddy's confrontation with Burntrap occurred in an underground chamber filled with incinerators and industrial equipment. The battle mechanics involved using these incinerators against Burntrap, burning him repeatedly while he attempted to possess Freddy and eliminate Gregory. Each time the flames hit him, Burntrap would laugh, a disturbing demonstration of his persistence and possibly his insanity after decades of death and rebirth. The laugh echoed William's earlier personality, the cruel enjoyment he took from others' suffering, now directed at his own burning. The ambiguity of this ending's canonicity complicates any assessment of Burntrap's ultimate fate. Security Breach featured multiple endings, and subsequent content like the Ruin DLC suggested the Burntrap encounter might not have occurred as shown, or might have been one possibility among several. In Ruin, when Cassie descended to areas where Burntrap should have been, the charging station was empty, with claw marks suggesting something had been dragged away or had escaped. This raised disturbing questions about Burntrap's current status. If he escaped, if he's still active somewhere in the Pizzaplex's depths or beyond, then William remains a threat. If he was destroyed or captured, then his pattern of returning suggests this wouldn't be permanent. William Afton had come back from death too many times, in too many forms, for anyone to confidently declare him finally ended. The Mimic, another entity discovered in the Pizzaplex's ruins, complicated matters further, and this old endoskeleton, tied to Edwin Murray's tragic history and programmed to copy behaviors it observed, had apparently learned William's patterns, adopted his methods, potentially even mimicked his consciousness in ways that made distinguishing between them difficult. Whether Burntrap was William or the mimic copying William became a central question, with troubling implications either way. If Burntrap was William, then he persisted despite everything that should have destroyed him. If Burntrap was the mimic, then William's legacy had transcended his individual existence, becoming a pattern that could be replicated and continued by entities that never knew him directly. Vanny's involvement in potential Burntrap-related activities suggested Glitchtrap's influence persisted regardless of the physical form's status. Vanessa, under the Vanny persona, conducted mysterious activities throughout the Pizzaplex, possibly attempting to rebuild William's body or provide him with new vessels for possession. The relationship between Vanny's actions, Glitchtrap's digital presence, and Burntrap's physical form suggested a coordinated effort, spanning multiple manifestations of William's consciousness or pattern. The Pizzaplex itself became William's newest tool, its vast size and complexity providing countless hiding places, its interconnected systems vulnerable to the kind of manipulation William specialized in, its purpose as children's entertainment, creating opportunities that aligned with his historical patterns. He had always operated from within Fazbear Entertainment establishments, using his position and access to facilitate his crimes. And Burntrap's presence beneath the Pizzaplex continued this tradition. The predator lurking beneath the playground, the monster hiding in the foundation of what appeared to be innocent fun. The debate over whether William Afton truly survived to become Burntrap, or whether his role in the franchise had ended, with the mimic taking over as the primary antagonist, reflected larger questions about legacy and pattern persistence. Even if William himself was finally truly destroyed, the systems he created, the traumas he inflicted, the methods he developed all persisted. The mimic's existence demonstrated that William's evil didn't require William's direct involvement to continue. It could be learned, copied, perpetuated by entities that adopted his behaviors without understanding their origins. Burntrap, whether William or mimic or some horrible fusion of both, represented the idea that some evils become self-perpetuating, that patterns can outlast their originators, that the damage inflicted by monsters like William Afton creates echoes that continue long after the original voice falls silent. The uncertainty about Burntrap's true nature and fate mirrored the uncertainty about whether William could ever be truly stopped, or whether he had become something beyond individual existence, an animating principle of evil that would find new hosts and new forms, regardless of what happened to any single manifestation. The legacy, eternal return and impact, William Afton's story, traced through decades from business founder to serial killer to undead horror to digital virus to enigmatic final form, represents more than one man's evil. It demonstrates how trauma propagates, how obsession corrupts, how the pursuit of power and immortality creates damage that outlasts any individual life. His catchphrase, "I always come back," proved true not just for him, but for the cycles of violence and possession he set in motion. The families William destroyed never recovered. Henry Emily lost his daughter Charlotte to William's first murder, then spent decades trying to undo the damage his business partner caused, ultimately sacrificing himself in fire to free the trapped souls. Michael Afton carried guilt for his brother's death throughout his life, pursuing his father's crimes and eventually dying in Henry's trap, while trying to make amends for a family legacy he never chose. Elizabeth Afton, killed by her father's murder machine, became something inhuman, and her personality merged with Circus Baby's programming into a confused entity that wanted freedom but didn't remember how to be a child. The crying child, William's youngest, died afraid and alone. His brief life defined by a terror his father could have prevented, but chose to study instead. The missing children, Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, Fritz, and Cassidy, lost their lives and decades of potential existence, trapped in animatronics instead of growing up, attending school, building relationships, experiencing anything beyond the nightmare of possession. Their families endured not just loss, but uncertainty, the horror of missing children whose bodies were never properly found or returned, whose killers evaded justice for years. The trauma radiated outward, touching parents, siblings, friends, entire communities that learned children weren't safe even in places designed for their entertainment. William's experimentation with remnant and possession created a supernatural disaster that persisted long after his crimes ended. The animatronics at various Freddy Fazbear's Pizza locations remained haunted, dangerous, attacking night guards and behaving in ways that couldn't be explained through simple mechanical malfunction. The possessions William facilitated created ongoing hazards, spirits trapped in metal unable to rest or move on, their confusion and trauma making them threats to anyone who encountered them after hours. His innovations in murder technology, the spring-lock suits used for killing, the funtime animatronics designed to capture children, the fear experiments conducted in underground facilities, in all represented applications of intelligence and engineering skill toward purely evil ends. William possessed the knowledge to create remarkable things, to advance robotics and AI, to build entertainment that genuinely brought joy. Instead, he weaponized his talents, turned machines meant to delight children into instruments of their destruction. The companies William helped found, Fredbear's Family Diner, Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, Circus Baby's Pizza World, even Fazbear Entertainment more broadly, all carried the stain of his crimes. Attempts to rebrand, to distance from past tragedies, to recontextualize the murders as fictional horror. None of it erased the reality of what happened in those establishments. The physical locations might burn or close or be rebuilt, but the history persisted, and the knowledge that children had been killed in these places for entertainment. William's pattern of returning demonstrated the limits of simple solutions to complex evil. Fire destroyed his physical forms repeatedly, but he found new vessels, new methods of existence. Legal prosecution never occurred because evidence remained incomplete and his position protected him from suspicion. Spiritual vengeance from Cassidy trapped him temporarily, but couldn't permanently end his consciousness. Technology gave him new paths through digital existence. Every attempt to stop William Afton definitively failed in some way, allowing him or his pattern or his legacy to continue. This persistence raised uncomfortable questions about whether William could be stopped at all, whether some evils become so entrenched, so adaptable, that they transcend individual existence. The ambiguity about whether Burntrap was William or the mimic copying William suggested the difference might not matter, that William Afton had become more than a person, transforming into a template, a pattern of behaviors that could be learned and replicated by entities that never met him. The psychological impact of William's crimes extended beyond direct victims. Every employee who worked at locations where murders occurred, every parent who brought children to establishments that harbored possessed animatronics, every investigator who tried and failed to solve the missing children case, they all carried pieces of the trauma William created. The ripples spread through communities, through time. I'm touching people who weren't even born when the original crimes occurred, but who inherited the consequences nonetheless. William's relationship with his own mortality proved paradoxical. He feared death enough to murder children in pursuit of immortality through remnant. He achieved a form of immortality through possession and digital existence. But this success trapped him in circumstances arguably worse than death. Consciousness without peace, existence without purpose beyond suffering and returning. The immortality he obtained wasn't freedom from death's limitations, but multiplication of death's horrors, dying and being reborn in worse forms, experiencing the punishment Cassidy inflicted, existing as a shambling corpse or hostile code. And his legacy to the Five Nights at Freddy's universe included not just the specific crimes and victims, but the revelation that possession was possible, that remnant existed, that souls could be bound to machinery. This knowledge didn't die with William. Others might discover it, might experiment as he did, might find ways to weaponize or exploit these supernatural mechanics. The precedent he established, that children could be killed to create possessed animatronics, that remnant could confer immortality, that consciousness could transfer to machines. These discoveries outlasted their discoverer. The thematic resonance of William Afton as a villain stemmed from how completely he embodied destructive obsession. He pursued understanding and power without regard for ethics, consequences, or basic humanity. He treated his own children as experimental subjects or inconveniences. He viewed other people's children as resources to be harvested. He wanted immortality, but couldn't articulate what he would do with it, couldn't justify the pursuit beyond the pursuit itself. His evil wasn't passionate or understandable. It was cold, systematic, driven by curiosity and ego more than hatred or revenge. In the broader context of horror villains, William stood out for his persistence and his methods. He didn't rely on supernatural power or physical superiority. He was human, at least initially, using intelligence and position to commit crimes that eventually gained supernatural dimensions. His ability to return from death wasn't magical resurrection, but application of the very mechanics he studied, a possession and remnant used on himself the same way he had used them on his victims. The scientist became his own test subject. The killer became possessed by his own remnant-sustained consciousness. The uncertainty about William's ultimate fate, whether he was truly ended or merely dormant or continuing through the mimic, or existing in some form not yet revealed, reflected the nature of evil more broadly. Individual villains can be stopped, but the patterns they establish, the damage they cause, the methods they develop, these often outlast them. William Afton might be gone, but the haunted animatronics remain. The remnant exists, the possessions persist. The trauma continues echoing through families and communities and the very foundations of the buildings where his crimes occurred. His story serves as a warning about unchecked ambition, about the dangers of viewing people as means rather than ends, about how easily someone with intelligence and resources can cause catastrophic harm when moral constraints erode. William had every advantage: business success, partnership with a talented inventor, family, opportunities. He chose to corrupt all of it, to poison every relationship, to turn every tool toward murder and experimentation. The waste of potential, the deliberate choice of evil over countless better options, made his crimes more disturbing than if he had been forced into villainy by circumstance. And yet, despite everything, despite decades of murder and the transformation into various horrific forms, William Afton remained fundamentally the same person he had been at the start, resentful of Henry's creativity and family happiness, obsessed with understanding and control, willing to sacrifice anyone, including his own children, for knowledge and power, convinced of his own brilliance. The forms changed, human to undead to digital to uncertain, but the core pattern persisted, proving that William Afton was less a man who became a monster and more a monster who briefly wore human form before revealing his true nature through action. Conclusion. The complete story of William Afton traces a descent from businessman to nightmare that spanned more than 50 years, from the late 1970s through the 2020s and possibly beyond. His journey touched countless lives, destroyed families, created supernatural disasters, and fundamentally altered the trajectory of everyone connected to Fazbear Entertainment, from partnership with Henry Emily, to murder of Charlotte, to the bite of 83, to Circus Baby's Pizza World, to the missing children incident, to Remnant harvesting to death in the Spring Bonnie suit, to decades as Springtrap to digital existence, as Glitchtrap to the ambiguous return as Burntrap. Every chapter revealed new depths of William's evil and new manifestations of his refusal to accept ending. His victims deserve remembrance. Charlotte Emily, Henry's daughter, first to die and first to possess, becoming the protective puppet. The crying child, William's youngest son, terrorized by his brother and killed by his father's machine. Elizabeth Afton, William's daughter, killed by Circus Baby and merged with the animatronics programming. Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, Fritz, and Cassidy, the 5 missing children, are murdered and stuffed into suits where they remain trapped for decades. Michael Afton, William's eldest son, burdened with guilt and eventually dying while trying to undo his father's damage. And countless others, the victims of William's fear experiments, the children the Funtime animatronics may have captured, anyone who encountered the possessed animatronics and paid the price for William's crimes. His pattern of returning, of finding new forms when old ones were destroyed, of persisting beyond every attempt to end him, proved the truth of his catchphrase even as it revealed its hollow horror. Yes, William always came back, but each return found him diminished, more damaged, less human, until the question of whether he even existed anymore became impossible to answer with certainty. The man became the monster, became the machine, became the code, became the mystery, each transformation moving further from anything recognizable as William Afton, until only the pattern remained. The ambiguity of his final fate serves the narrative more than certainty ever could. If William is truly gone, then his legacy persists through the mimic and the haunted animatronics and the trauma he inflicted. If he remains in some form, then the threat continues, the cycle unbroken, the possibility of return always looming. Either way, William Afton's impact on the 5 Nights at Freddy's universe proved permanent, shaping the franchise's fundamental conflict between innocence and evil, between machines and humanity, between the drive to create joy and the capacity to corrupt it. His story reminds us that monsters are made, not born. William chose his path at every step, selected evil from available options, weaponized his intelligence toward destruction. He could have been a successful businessman, a supportive father, a valuable partner to Henry. He chose instead to be a murderer, an experimenter, a predator who viewed children as resources and immortality as worth any cost. That choice, repeated across decades in different forms and through different methods, defined him more completely than any single act or transformation. As you drift off tonight, consider not just William's crimes, but the echoes they created, the lives destroyed and disrupted, the supernatural consequences that persisted long after the man himself should have ended. Think about Henry Emily, driven to suicide by fire to undo his partner's evil. Think about Michael Afton, dying while trying to atone for a family name he never chose. Think about Charlotte Emily and the missing children, trapped in animatronics when they should have been living full lives. And think about how patterns of harm can outlast their originators, how damage propagates through time, how some evils become self-perpetuating systems that continue independent of the individuals who began them. If you found this journey through William Afton's complete story helpful, consider liking and subscribing. Let me know in the comments what aspects of his character or crimes you found most disturbing, or which of his many forms you think represented him most completely. And rest well, knowing that understanding monsters doesn't mean fearing them, that knowledge about evil helps us recognize and resist it, that even the darkest stories can be examined safely from the comfort of our own beds as sleep slowly takes hold. Thank you for listening, and good night.